They called it a death trap. A rolling coffin. A joke compared to the mighty German Tiger. But as Europe burned and steel beasts clashed across muddy fields, one truth emerged: the Sherman tank refused to die. While German engineers built monsters of metal, powerful, precise, but fragile, the Americans built a fighter that endured. It wasn't the strongest, or the fastest, or the thickest armored. But it was everywhere, rolling through France, charging into Germany, carrying hope on its tracks. The Tiger was feared. The Panther was respected. But the Sherman was remembered. Because when the war ended, it wasn't the German giants that still roamed the battlefields, it was the humble Sherman, still moving, still fighting, still proving that in war, survival means more than strength. This is the story of the tank that outlasted legends. World War II was a battlefield of extremes, where technology evolved faster than human understanding, and where every weapon carried both brilliance and brutality. Among the giants of that era stood one of the most debated machines ever built, the American M4 Sherman tank. To some, it was a symbol of industrial might, to others, a steel coffin sent to die against the unstoppable Tigers and Panthers of Nazi Germany. But beneath the smoke and chaos, the truth was far more complex. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the strongest, it was designed to win wars. It could be built faster, fixed easier, and deployed in numbers that reshaped the balance of power. It became the beating heart of Allied offensives, pushing relentlessly through Europe's burning fields. This is not just the story of a tank, it's the story of strategy over strength, resilience over perfection, and how an underdog machine helped turn the tide of history. When World War II erupted, armored warfare was still in its infancy. The world had witnessed tanks crawl across the muddy trenches of World War I, but by the late 1930s, a new generation of machines was being born, faster, deadlier, and more decisive. Germany led the charge, crafting tanks that became symbols of terror, the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the legendary Tiger. Their armor was thick, their guns precise, their presence on the battlefield almost mythical. Allied troops dreaded their roar before they ever saw them. Across the Atlantic, American engineers faced a question that would define the war: should they build the most powerful tank, or the most practical one? The answer came in the form of the M4 Sherman. Designed in 1941, it was not meant to dominate through fear or armor thickness. It was designed for production, mobility, and reliability. Where Germany produced a few hundred Tigers, America could produce thousands of Shermans. Factories from Detroit to Chicago roared day and night, forging a tank that could be shipped across oceans, repaired in the field, and driven by men who had never seen combat before. It was a tank made not for heroes, but for armies. By the time the Sherman rolled into battle in North Africa, it represented the power of mass production and the American belief that quantity, when paired with coordination, could overcome even the most fearsome enemy. German tanks might have ruled the battlefield in duels, but wars were not won in duels, they were won by who could keep fighting when the other side broke down. The Sherman was the machine that didn't just roll forward, it kept coming, again and again, until the enemies were shattered. It was the embodiment of endurance, and endurance would soon prove more powerful than any German cannon. When the M4 Sherman first met the German Tiger, the result seemed almost inevitable, and terrifying. In the rolling plains of Tunisia and the shattered villages of France, Allied crews suddenly faced a predator that felt invincible. The Tiger's 88mm gun could tear through a Sherman from over a mile away. Its armor was so thick that Sherman shells often bounced off, leaving only scorch marks and despair. For many young American and British crews, the first sight of a Tiger meant the end. Stories spread through the ranks, tales of Tigers destroying entire platoons before they could even return fire. Soldiers whispered that their tanks were nothing but tin cans. Yet even in the face of fear, they kept fighting. Because they had no choice. The Sherman was outmatched in a duel, but the battlefield wasn't a duel, it was chaos. Smoke, mud, confusion, and movement turned power into vulnerability. The Tiger was slow, cumbersome, and few in number. The Sherman was everywhere. 5 Shermans could surround one Tiger. 10 could hunt it down. When one burned, another took its place. The Germans had power, the Americans had persistence. In Normandy, after D-Day, this difference began to matter. While German tanks waited for fuel, spare parts, and the perfect ambush, the Shermans kept rolling. Allied supply lines stretched from the beaches to the front lines, feeding an army that never stopped moving. And behind every Sherman was a crew, 5 men bound by fear, courage, and the constant knowledge that survival depended on teamwork. They gave their tank a name, painted symbols on its hull, treated it as more than metal. It became a home in hell. They learned to fight smart. They avoided frontal duels, flanked Tigers, used the terrain, smoke, and sheer coordination. A Sherman might not survive a head-on encounter, but it could win by surprise. Its turret turned faster, its engines started quicker, and when it broke, field crews patched it up in hours, not weeks. By late 1944, the Allies had learned how to fight the German giants, not with superior machines, but with superior strategy. Air support, numbers, logistics, and courage replaced raw firepower. On the battlefields of France, it wasn't just tanks clashing, it was philosophies. German perfection versus American pragmatism. And as the war dragged on, the cracks in German perfection began to show. Because in a war of exhaustion, it's not the strongest that wins, it's the one that keeps fighting after the strongest has fallen. By the summer of 1944, the war had shifted. The German Tiger and Panther tanks still inspired terror, but the Allies had learned how to fight smarter. The Sherman tank, once mocked, was now the heartbeat of a war machine that simply refused to stop. Behind every Sherman stood a vast industrial army, thousands of factories, engineers, mechanics, and workers across the United States. While German tank crews waited weeks for replacement parts, American Shermans were repaired overnight. If one was destroyed, another rolled off a ship within days. It wasn't just about having more tanks, it was about having a system that made every loss meaningless to the greater machine. The German tanks were masterpieces of engineering, heavy, intricate, precise, but that was their weakness. They were too perfect. Their gears jammed, engines overheated, and their immense weight often broke bridges and bogged them down in mud. Each Tiger required immense fuel, which Germany no longer had. Each breakdown was a setback they couldn't afford. Meanwhile, the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a concept built for war. Its design emphasized speed, simplicity, and adaptability. It could be fitted with different guns, flamethrowers, rocket launchers, even mine-clearing equipment. It wasn't the strongest tank, but it was the most flexible. Wherever there was a problem, there was a Sherman version to solve it. As the Allies advanced through France, the Shermans began to dominate not by brute force, but by mobility and coordination. They moved with infantry, worked with air support, and overwhelmed the enemy with relentless pressure. In the hedgerows of Normandy, Sherman crews learned to fight as hunters, not prey. They used smoke to mask movements, radio coordination to ambush German armor, and artillery to finish what their guns couldn't. When a Tiger fired one devastating shot, 3 Shermans moved to flank and strike from behind. And then came the Firefly, a British modification of the Sherman armed with a powerful 17-pounder gun. Suddenly, the balance changed. Now, a Sherman could destroy a Tiger, if the shot was well placed. The Firefly gave Allied crews something they had never had before, confidence. The Germans realized it too. Their once dominant beasts were now targets in a new kind of war, one where mobility and supply lines mattered more than armor thickness. As the Allies surged through occupied Europe, the battlefield told a silent truth. Burned-out Tigers littered the fields, too few, too late, too heavy to save Hitler's crumbling empire. But the Shermans? They kept rolling. From Normandy to the Rhine, through mud, snow, and fire, they carried the war on their backs. The world saw the shift, from a war of elite machines to a war of endurance, strategy, and relentless production. The Sherman was never meant to win tank duels, it was built to win wars. And as 1944 gave way to 1945, it became clear, the true weapon of the Allies wasn't just technology, it was the unbreakable rhythm of a machine that never stopped fighting. By early 1945, the tide of war had completely turned. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was collapsing under the weight of its own perfection. The Tigers and Panthers, marvels of engineering, sat abandoned on roadsides, engines seized, tracks broken, fuel tanks empty. Meanwhile, the Shermans rolled on. Through bombed-out towns, snow-covered forests, and shattered bridges, the same inferior tank that once drew laughter now symbolized the Allies' relentless advance. For the men who fought inside them, the Sherman was more than steel, it was survival. Crews often named their tanks after wives, girlfriends, or hometowns. Each name painted on a hull turned cold machinery into something human. When one Sherman was destroyed, the men who survived often climbed into another and kept fighting. They knew its flaws, thin armor, limited firepower, but they also knew its gifts, speed, simplicity, and reliability. It could climb hills German tanks couldn't. It could be fixed with a wrench and wire. And when something broke, there were spare parts waiting. The Germans might have had the better tank, but the Americans had the better system. In the Battle of the Bulge, this difference became undeniable. As German armor smashed into Allied lines, the Shermans fought back in brutal winter conditions. Many were destroyed, but replacements poured in faster than Germany could recover. For every Tiger that rolled out of a factory, 10 Shermans crossed the channel. It was a war of endurance, and endurance always favors the one who can adapt. Air power became the Sherman's greatest ally. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons prowled the skies, hunting German tanks from above. When the Sherman crews called for support, bombs and rockets rained down. The coordination between air and armor created a deadly rhythm Germany couldn't match. By April 1945, as Allied forces stormed into Germany, the Sherman had become the symbol of unstoppable momentum. It was the tank that refused to die, the machine that carried ordinary men to extraordinary victory. Its story wasn't about superiority, it was about survival, teamwork, and persistence. After the war, as the Tigers rusted in museums and fields, the Sherman continued its journey. It served in Korea, in Israel, in dozens of nations for decades after World War II ended. Its design inspired generations of tanks to come. The Sherman proved something profound, that war isn't just about who builds the strongest weapon, but who builds the weapon that lasts. It was a machine born of necessity, perfected through struggle, and remembered not for power, but for perseverance. When the dust settled over Europe, the world didn't remember the tanks that burned out trying to be perfect, it remembered the one that kept rolling long after the others stopped. The Sherman tank didn't just survive the war, it outlived it. When the smoke of war finally cleared, the world stood divided, but one machine had crossed every battlefield and outlasted every rival, the Sherman tank. It was never meant to be a legend, and yet, that's exactly what it became. The German Tigers and Panthers, though unmatched in power, were victims of their own brilliance. They were designed for victory in theory, not for the brutal, grinding reality of war. The Sherman, humble and unassuming, was designed for that reality. It wasn't built to impress, it was built to endure. And that endurance changed history. It rolled through Africa's deserts, Europe's farmlands, and into the heart of Germany. It carried men who were not just soldiers, but brothers bound by survival. It proved that success in war is not born from perfection, but from persistence, from the ability to adapt, to rebuild, to keep moving forward even when everything burns around you. The Sherman tank survived because it reflected the spirit of the men who built it and the armies who fought with it, ordinary people who refused to quit. In the end, history doesn't remember the strongest machines. It remembers the ones that stood the test of time. And when the echoes of battle fade, it's the Sherman that still rumbles quietly in the distance, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a symbol of survival. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you that history isn't just about machines, but about the men who drove them and the choices that shaped our world, then don't let it fade into silence. Because every tank, every soldier, every scar in the earth tells a story worth remembering. The Sherman's legacy isn't buried in rusted steel, it lives on in the lessons it taught, that strength means nothing without endurance, and that courage is built one heartbeat at a time. Here on WW2 Tales, we bring those moments back to life, the forgotten faces, the overlooked battles, the truth hidden behind the smoke. So if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe, share, and keep the memory alive. Because history doesn't die when the guns fall silent, it lives when we choose to remember.